one of the slides I use, and this is just a thought piece, it's a fairly complicated slide for people who don't do data analysis all the time, is that what's happening within FDA is that if you were to look at the broad attributes of what happens with data, and this is from a guy by the name of Rob Wetzel that we work with, he's in the Department of Defense, as you look at what needs a lot of memory, big storage, big changes, or other things that we have to do. In those four quadrants, FDA probably sits down in the bottom left right now, and we don't have a lot of data per se that people think we do, and it's around maybe 15 terabytes for any particular object that we look at. However, as we start looking at multidimensional approaches to things, then we're going to start moving probably up in this graph, so you have to look at more speed of information and then start moving to the right. And once you start moving to the right in this particular graph, and I wish I had, this is almost a lecture right here, you require different kinds of analytics to be able to look at it. So our great frequentist approaches and Bayesian statistics were well on the left, but they break down on the right. So there's an implicit thing with whoever we collaborate with, that the analytics and how they change when you approach big data are going to be extremely important because it comes suddenly. Now there's one particular attribute of the big data issue for FDA that's maybe a little bit different. As opposed to a bank where it's volume and location, for FDA it may not necessarily be a large volume, but the dimensions of association are going to be much, much greater. So, for example, a person who's living in the Southeast and has a Jamaican background and suddenly takes a gold compound with rheumatoid arthritis seems to have an unusual reaction to the gold. And we know that historically the genomic structure, the genomic elements that we look at for that particular population, the HLA-B27 group, seem to be very different for people who have other groups. So we're looking at associations like that are not necessarily implicit, they are associated, and we have to be able to look at those and then apply that context into a national scale. Because if you would say to take a Jamaican with a B27 flag on it and put it in different parts of the United States, you'd expect the same outcome to occur if you treated them with gold. And it turns out not to be the case. And we have to figure out why that is. And it could be that regional variations in clinical practice cause different problems. That's not normally done either with Bayesian statistics or frequentist statistics, so more high-level kind of analysis you would see more in the Department of Defense. So applications of those kinds of things will be very important. So the last slide I talked about information sources. So the ingestion of multiple information sources, beginning to appreciate, is very important for a very specific reason. This is some work that has been done by Ravi Harpez, and there's more categories than these 8 that I'm talking about, but let's just go through each segment because they each have a different implication. Now, where we sit right now in terms of rapid is we're looking at spontaneous reports, and it's a 4% slice of everything that's spontaneous reports. So right now in our cloud system, we only have 2012 as our database, but we have to expand to the entire database, which goes back to 1965, and right now it's probably around 12 to 13 million reported cases. In each case, we'll have about 300 reported elements to it. That's the starting point. If you look at things like health records, which I talked about a little bit earlier, we're beginning to appreciate that health records aren't good for telling you the incidence or occurrence of a case. It'll tell you how they develop and why. So, for example, if I was to look at a health record, on the claims side, you'll see a patient is getting, by billing, ciprofloxacin for 3 days, and then switches over to azithromycin. It makes sense. Why would you do that? You go to the narrative side, and you realize that on ciprofloxacin, the 65-year-old patient got psychotic, which is very common with that particular drug, and they switched over. So that's what a health record will tell you. Not necessarily the case occurred here, but why it occurred. If you go to the health literature, there's that same attribute. We use NLP to pull out key safety information from the Medline resources. And what we're beginning to realize that that particular resource is very good if you have the right NLP tool to identify what we call marginal adverse events. And what we mean by that is that FAERS has a bias, that's the spontaneous reports data, in that it does really good at really severe, really rare events. But for common events that have certain subtle signals to it, FAERS is terrible at that. So if you do the surveillance within the printed literature, the medical literature, we're able to find some of those things that result in not maybe drug withdrawal, but modification of the labels. Clinical trials is also in that same category. It's a little bit more complicated because the language used in the clinical trials is not quite uniform. But we're working on NLP approaches to look at that kind of information. Product labeling is particularly important for use in generic drugs. And the reason for that is you would assume that all the different drugs that were penicillin should have the same label in terms of what the adverse events are and those kinds of things. It turned out that's not the case. And to be able to determine which drug labels might have a problem, we have to manually look at each label. And if you recall, I said there are over 1,000 penicillins. So how do you get to that particular problem? It's saying that one label is out of the norm. And what we're looking at is doing a complete ingestion of the labeling library that we have into a searchable form so that we can get that information when we need it. Search logs is a special case. Maybe come to that at the end because it takes a little bit of a story to do that. Social media is not a great surveillance instrument for what we do, but it is a good warning sign of a problem that's very large or that newspapers are causing an issue. And the reason that's important for us is that when we do our normal surveillance, if you see a peak, the most common cause of a peak for new reports are lawyers filing adverse event cases. So we have to be able to statistically remove that so we look at what's truly a problem and what's a litigation problem. Chemical and biologic stuff I'll do in terms of a story. And I think I talked a little bit about it in that. But when I first started at FDA, one of the most ferocious battles we had was with a particular drug called Avandia. And Avandia, as you know, is a diabetic controls drug, and there's a lot of argument about whether it caused increased rates of heart attack. Our approach was to use epidemiologic studies, but the score we would need to say we withdraw this from the market just wasn't strong enough. It was a 1.8, where it has to be at least a 2.0. So we argued about it for 2 years. I mean, really almost bench brawl kind of things. We didn't know at that particular time that in another lab in a different part of FDA, they were using virtual models of the heart. And in all the models, they test the different receptors that are on muscle cells that are associated with disease, and one is called PPAR5. The one receptor that this Avandia drug activates is PPAR5. So in the model, you would know that it would cause a heart signal, but we didn't know it at the time. So one of the issues around RAPID is that when you get information like that, there's some place for it to see it in one place, so you can assemble it and say, well, you know, the virtual model says this, the epidemiologic log says it's pretty close to being a real problem, and then with the combined information, you can make a decision that's more informed. And then the last one, the search logs, is a specific use case. That's usually done as a collaboration with Microsoft or Google. And the way that works is that if we have a large group of people that are agreeable to research, and I'll use breast cancer as an example, you stratify them out of all the searches on a particular range. We realize that for women between the ages of 18 to 45, there's a subset that all of a sudden has a stream to what they search for. Types of breast cancer. How do you diagnose breast cancer? What do you do if you have adenocarcinoma with breast cancer? Chemotherapy for breast cancer. Specific drugs and complications of that drug. And then survival. So what you've seen through the search pattern is the clinical construction of what a woman goes through when they're diagnosed with breast cancer. You want to know how it's diagnosed, complications. Since she searched for adenocarcinoma, you know this person probably specifically had adenocarcinoma, which we'd want to know. And then when they look for the complications of the chemotherapy, whether it's CHOP or there's a whole bunch of them, let's say they're looking for cisplatin, and that causes a particular problem with the throat. They start searching for that. I can reconstruct that this person had this kind of breast cancer at this level and got a complication due to cisplatin that's documented by our search pattern. So all 8 of those in consortium can be used to get a real three-dimensional view of what happens to a person in drug safety, or the flip side, if it's drug efficacy. The efficacy is a little, I'll use that carefully, in that we're looking for patient outcomes. If you do something, what happens? Efficacy means that it's better than something else, which you can't quite do, but that kind of information can be obtained. So the diversity of information, not only these, but others, are important to assemble as a collage of information so that the skill reviewers, like Bruce and myself, that look at something and tell our bosses, you know, in this particular case, based on these levels of evidence, it is pretty strong. We need to withdraw this drug from the market and be able to back it up. And the reason that's important, and I don't know if any of you had the experience, maybe you have, but sitting in a room and telling, you know, a company, okay, it's a complete response to this, we're removing it from the market, those people lose their job that minute, that hour. You know, so there's a lot of major things that occur, and that's why having the diversity of information that gives us an accurate view of what's happening is really critical, because you could drop a $1 billion industry very quickly if you make a mistake. And that's what we're living with every day when we make a decision. And that's why for Rapid, in an emergency, we're looking at a system to provide us that diversity of information, the ability to make some reasonable decisions in real time, and be able to converse with our superiors so they can make the major decisions they have to make in a regulatory sense.